Hello, my name is Omar Harami. Thank you for joining us for the latest Kumi Now online gathering as we learn about collective punishment. Before we start, I'd like to remind you that this session is being broadcasted live on Facebook. If you do not wish to appear, please turn off your video feed. We would also love it if you could quickly share one of the links that are being shared in the chat so that others may join. We are now inviting people from the audience to tell us how you are applying Kumi Now back in your community or are otherwise advocating for justice and peace in Palestine and Israel. If you have an idea for a project you'd like to share for up to 5 minutes in a future meeting, please send us an email at kumi@kuminow.com. Now it's time for our weekly action. Mark, could you please launch the poll? Let us first ask Sarit to introduce herself, who will be our main speaker for today.
Okay, so hi everyone, and first of all, thank you very much for joining this meeting. And what I thought I'd do is, first of all, if you could indicate that you can hear me properly, that would be great. Maybe just kind of like, okay, great, because sometimes the sound quality isn't that great with these headphones. Secondly, I wanted to introduce myself quickly, and then later on I'll talk a little bit about B'Tselem, the organization I work for. So I'm Israeli. I was born here, grew up in Jerusalem. I'm currently in Tel Aviv, which is hot and humid in the midst of a heat wave. I assume some of you are also experiencing it in various parts of the world. And I spent many years of my life living abroad as well. So when I was in my early 20s, I traveled to the UK. I lived for many years in London, where I actually also studied, did my BA and my master's. And then in the early years of the first decade of this century, I returned to Israel to live in Tel Aviv, and I pretty much quickly, about 6 months after I got back, I started work at B'Tselem, and that was almost 17 years ago. So clearly, I've been doing this for a long time. For the first 12 years of my career, I was the media spokesperson of the organization based on experience I had in working in the media in my youth. And then in the last 5 or 6 years, I've been working as the international advocacy officer for the organization, which means that on some levels it's quite similar. I'm still responsible for creating networks and expressing information and messaging and sending out material. But on other levels, my job is a bit easier because I don't get phone calls from journalists 24/7, which is how it used to be. I was the media spokesperson. And my role currently is primarily with the international community and with international civil society in order to harness these contacts in order to promote B'Tselem's objectives. And I'll get to that a bit later. Otherwise, what can I say? I've been also involved in a lot of activism over the last 20 or so years, primarily in the occupied territories. I've been involved in documenting and analyzing the protests, the popular protests that Palestinians have been launching over the last almost 20 years in the West Bank. First of all, it was protests against the wall in places like the Barrier and places like Bil'in and Nalin, and then other protests against the occupation and against takeovers in places like Nabi Saleh and others, and Kadum. I think you may have heard of these villages. And my main role there has been to document the way the Israeli security forces use crowd control weapons in order to stop these protests, in order to, and how they also arrest protesters, use various legal and practical tools to try and stifle the popular Palestinian struggle, and generally trying to kind of look at how the Israeli authorities kind of maintain this regime of occupation through the stifling and through the silencing of protest. Other than that, I live in Tel Aviv, and I'm trying to kind of do other things other than just focus on the occupation, primarily to swim and do some mountain biking and kind of like being out a little bit. Over the last year or so, it's been, a big deal. I think being able to be outside and to enjoy, not being locked down like all of us. And yeah, I'm very happy to be here. And what we thought I would do is give a short presentation on the issues that we're discussing, but then also, if you guys have other questions, I'll be very happy to respond to them, or to either, if I know the answers, obviously happy to do that, or if not, to try and refer you to the right source.
Thank you, Sarit. We have a tradition of updating people on the main news that is happening on the ground. So, one second. So, yes. So for the people, we encourage everybody to register and to be reading the Sabil Wave of Prayer that came out this morning. Because it would cover more topics of the main things that are happening in the country. As many people have been following, in Sheikh Jarrah, 4 families went to the High Court, and there was a discussion at the High Court. The Israeli High Court tried to find a solution that the Palestinian families would pay a symbolic rent and acknowledge that the Israeli owners of their houses, the people have refused, and they said we refuse to pay rent and acknowledge that they own our houses, and they're demanding an investigation be held at the High Court, and the decision is be made on, rather than paying rent, on who is the owners of the land. So there is no solution, but people were very excited that there were so much news attention given to the Sheikh Jarrah story. So people don't feel in Sheikh Jarrah that they have been abandoned by the international community or by the rest of the Palestinian community. Today is big celebration. So wherever you go in the West Bank and Gaza, you'll hear fireworks. The results for the exams of the Palestinian education system have been released. So people are celebrating. Wherever you go, every corner has people distributing sweets, chocolates, ice creams, and people dancing. And it's going to be a very difficult night for people to sleep. According to reports, 98 Palestinians have been are under administrative detention, arrested only in July. So that's a big number compared to previous months. It's a huge jump, and Israel seems not to abandon the system of administrative detention. There has been successful hunger strikes by Palestinian prisoners who are under administrative detention, but it seems that it's like a game. Israel re-arrests the same people, continues with the same measures, so it continues to be a high place of tension in Israeli prisons for political prisoners. Today, there were at Ofar prison. The army went and the security forces went into the sections of the Palestinian prisoners, and a number have been beaten heavily. Ramallah on Monday had a huge demonstration, and the demonstration was focusing on, demanding justice. Nizar Banat, a Palestinian activist, was killed during detention, died during detention. His body has many bruises, which indicates that he has been tortured by the Palestinian security forces. Although the Palestinian government said that they will open an investigation, honestly, there is no serious steps. The PA continues to postpone announcements, and this is creating a very big frustration among the people. People feel that the rights that are continuously being violated by the Israeli occupation are also being violated by the PA. So there's great frustration in Palestine from the politicians and the political parties, mainly Fatah, the governing political party in the West Bank. So people are demanding elections. Now there is a movement among a number of Palestinian activists and organizations demanding in 2 weeks, either elections are called or they're calling for an uprising. So the country is very tense currently. Israel today recorded over 4,000 cases of COVID-19. That's the highest since 5 months. So although life was going back to normal in Palestine and Israel, it seems that we're heading back into restrictions. Already certain travel bans have been imposed, and more policies are being considered by the ministries of health, both in Palestine and Israel. So it seems tourism and pilgrimage will take a longer time to go back to normal. So we will move now to the main topic of today, and Sarit, you are the co-host. If you'd like to share a slide or something, please feel free.
So I don't have slides, but what I will do is post links to the different stories or items, as we call them, that I'm going to talk about to the Zoom or to the chat feature, so you guys can always then look and read back. And do you just want me to start with discussing B'Tselem and our work right now, or is there any specific other issue Omar you'd like me to get into, or just get into? Okay, Omar, asking you. Just okay. So I'll just start by maybe saying just a few words about B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories. So we are an Israeli organization founded in 1989 during the first Intifada, the first Palestinian uprising. And the organization, I think from the outset, was established from the perspective that Israel has certain obligations as an occupying force in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, etc., etc. And that not only is it not adhering to these obligations, but it is also, violating them in order to obtain its own benefits. I think the best example is the Israeli settlement enterprise. B'Tselem's foundation was established by a group of jurists, human rights activists, lawyers, journalists, and some politicians, in fact, from then probably the kind of like left and center. Today, I think there are far fewer supporters we have in the political scene in Israel, pretty much just from the left and more radical left. And I think that shows, that's quite indicative of how Israeli politics have changed, not really just how B'Tselem has changed. And from the start, as an Israeli organization, the purpose of B'Tselem looked at Israeli government responsibility for human rights violations inherent to the occupation. from the perspective that we, and when I say we here in this context, I mean Israelis, occupy Palestinians, we have obligations, and there is a need for an Israeli organization to monitor these violations and to demand change. I think when we look back at the history of the organization, I think one of the key issues at the time was the sense that many people had that the occupation is a temporary matter, right? That it's, of course, in any case, an occupation is a temporary system. It's a legal framework. And at the time, I think there was a feeling that if we only reflect to Israelis what is being done in our name by our government in the occupied territories, this will also spur people on to action, and to action will be to end the occupation. I think we have changed greatly our assessment of reality since then. I don't want to, be too dismissive about the past. I mean, I'm being quite, I'm summarizing up a very complex assessment that existed then of reality. But today, I think we're in the occupation's 54th year, I think, and this is thinking that we've reached, or that we've been engaged in for far longer, for many years now. We are absolutely sure that the reality on the ground currently is not of a temporary occupation. I think this case has been, open and shut a long time ago, right? There's no need to continue to try and convince people the occupation is not temporary, it's permanent. And in fact, recently B'Tselem released a position paper, which I'll post in a second, that describes the entire regime that is applied by the Israeli government from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River as a regime of apartheid, a regime of Jewish supremacy. And this is I will link now. This is from our most recent position paper. So I think it's worthwhile looking at this, because it indicates, I think, our developing assessment of the situation on the ground, and also our growing commitment to describing accurately and openly this reality. We use the term apartheid. Recently, another very important organization, Human Rights Watch, released a report that goes into the very deep legalistic aspects of this, of the Israel's apartheid regime. Another Israeli organization, Yesh Din, released a legal opinion last year, or 2 years ago, in which it describes the situation in the West Bank as one of apartheid. And I think it's very, very important to remember that prior to all of these statements, Palestinian human rights organizations and Palestinian activists have been talking about Israeli apartheid and describing their reality, the reality that they live under as such. I think this is important, because if we are going to move forward now and to try and remedy the situation, we need to be willing to describe what is going on the ground truthfully. And certainly B'Tselem has moved far beyond simply thinking that information and the documentation and research that we do is enough to lead to meaningful change. We are convinced now, and we have been for quite a number of years, and we've been advocating, according to this conviction, that there is a need for international action, concrete international action to get Israel to end its regime of occupation and apartheid. We have called on the international community to take this action. Now, I think, again, so that's not to say that B'Tselem is no longer interested and no longer sees the value of documentation and of research. On the contrary, we are absolutely committed to documenting meticulously and reporting and writing reports, and they don't have to be long reports, they can be short, concise reports, but revealing, documenting, and then exposing the reality on the ground for Palestinians living under occupation, but also what this actually means, the systemic aspects of Israel's occupation and human rights violations, and also trying to analyze what actually has enabled the continuation and the perpetuation of this regime. So all of this is stuff that we are still doing, but I think very importantly today, from the perspective that the entire regime that applies to the entire region, the entire area between the river and the sea, falls under this, this analysis. I should also maybe say that B'Tselem isn't saying that that Israeli apartheid is identical to South African apartheid. It's not an historical analogy, although there are some aspects that are similar, strikingly similar. But apartheid is also a very relevant legal pronouncement currently. It is an international crime, and it's part of the ICC statute. And this is a very pertinent conversation that is ongoing these days in many sources that we are hoping to move forward. Now, I should also maybe say that B'Tselem has releases information and does research on a whole range of issues that affect Palestinians in the occupied territories. I mean, we just released right now, and I think about half an hour ago in Israeli time, we released a press release with video footage taken from security cameras during the incident which occurred early this week in the village of Bet Umar, excuse me, not early this week, the following week, in the village of Bet Umar, in which a Palestinian child was shot by soldiers. Our field researchers managed to obtain 2 video clips, which we released today, documenting the absolutely disproportionate and callous nature of this shooting. So this is one example among many of information that we research and collect and reveal. Obviously, not just the information, but also our assessment, our conclusions. And we also produce information and document fatality figures and fatality cases. So we try and document all cases where Palestinians are killed by Israeli security forces, and provide in our database, which I can link to in a moment, information about the specifics of these cases. We also, in our database, provide information about Israelis killed by Palestinians in the framework of the conflict, of the situation in Palestine. And we provide a lot of other information as well in our databases, including, for example, lists of and numbers and figures on Palestinian homes demolished by the Israeli authorities. We have a whole range of other reports that deal with home demolitions and with Israeli actions to forcibly transfer, attempts to forcibly transfer Palestinian communities from Area C, so from 60% of the West Bank that is still under full Israeli control. That is another essential part of the work, or a central issue that B'Tselem researches. We do a lot of research on settler violence and how that is a state-backed enterprise. We also do a lot of research on Gaza and on the Israeli blockade, but also, unfortunately, on the results of rounds of hostilities that Israel keeps having with Gaza. The most recent, Israeli bombardment of Gaza was in May. We, in the framework of its conflict with the Hamas, the de facto government in Gaza, and B'Tselem is going to hopefully soon release both our list of fatalities from this period, but also some additional research and information. So all of this information that we research and publicize is available online on our website. You're more than welcome to to look at the website. Additionally, we are very active on social media. We try and make our voice heard on social media, both in Hebrew, English, and in Arabic. So everything we write is publicized we publish in 3 languages, and you're welcome to also try and to follow B'Tselem on Facebook or Twitter, and everything is available and there for you to watch and to share as well. And I think maybe this is pretty much the kind of introduction to B'Tselem and to our work. And now I'll try and maybe focus specifically on certain aspects of the issue of collective punishment, which is what I was invited to talk about. And as I said, do feel free to ask questions. If there's any way to kind of interrupt me and you want to ask something quite urgent, try and do that. Maybe raise your hand. I think there's also probably a feature for that. If not, I'll go through the chat later and try and kind of address all of the questions. And first, maybe I should also point out that I'm not going to present the issue exhaustively, i.e. it's a massive issue. I'll try and give some examples of the Israeli authorities' use of collective punishment against Palestinians and certain aspects of these policies. I should also, so it's certainly far from going to be a kind of an exhaustive review of the entire issue, but it would allow you, I'll also post links to the reports on the short research that B'Tselem has done on this issue in order to then allow you some additional resources. So I think maybe I should first start with, I should say our basic position, which is that collective punishment is absolutely prohibited because no one should be punished for the actions of someone else. And certainly this is a tenet in Judaism as well. There's a very clear it demands, and this issue is this principle, which is also a human principle, is enshrined both in the Bible and also in the Geneva Convention, which applies to the occupied territories. The Geneva Convention demands or states that no protected person may be punished for an offense that he or she has not personally committed. Collective penalties and likewise all measures of intimidation or of terrorism are prohibited, pillage is prohibited, reprisals against protected persons and their property are prohibited. This is a very basic demand, and the reason I'm mentioning both the kind of Jewish traditional position and also or the Jewish biblical position, I should say, and also the international humanitarian legal position is that it seems like this is a very clear moral issue as well as a legal issue. But unfortunately, as part of its occupation and of its actions in the occupied territories, the Israeli military, the Israeli government have been engaging in a whole range of different practices that constitute collective punishment. The first, I think, most prominent issue that I'd like to talk about briefly is the notion of home demolition as punishment. Israel, for a while now, has renewed a once kind of like prevalent and then kind of like I should say this, I'll put it differently. Israel, from the beginning, the early days of the occupation, demolished homes as punishment. This was not something rare, and in fact, on some levels, it was grounded in the emergency regulations that were established by the British mandate in Palestine, in pre-1948 Palestine. The practice was stopped in 2005 and then renewed by the Israeli authorities in the previous decade. Now, demolishing someone's home as punishment is effectively when Palestinians perpetrate some sort of attack against Israelis, and they will be, virtually every single time they'll be either caught, at the time or killed, or in the case of the suicide bombers, killed themselves. They'll, it seems like it's virtually impossible for them not to be apprehended. And then they're tried, if they are alive, they're tried and sentenced to very long periods of incarceration. But in addition to this, the Israeli army will then go and demolish the home in which their family lived, right? The person who perpetrated the attack certainly is not involved, is not living in that home any longer. The people who are living there are completely innocent. If they were suspected of other offenses, they could have been charged and prosecuted for those other offenses. So that's not the case. So it's clear that they're innocent. Yet the authorities will come and blow up, or in some cases bulldoze, their home. I'd like to show you some statistics on this practice. Let me see if I can share my screen with you. I can. And I'm sharing our B'Tselem's database, which I'll link to in a second. I could actually just link to right now. So you can also look at this screen and look at the numbers of housing units that were demolished, and the numbers of people and of children left homeless by this practice since it was renewed. So you can see that it was stopped in 2005 and renewed in 2009. This, basically to show that almost every year of the last 20 years, there have been punitive demolitions. Give me just 1 second to post the address of this database. And this, maybe I should just mention that this database is a recent addition to our website. It's an interactive database, so you can also make many queries and pull a lot of information from it. I think, let me just stop the sharing for a moment. B'Tselem's position, as well as the position of the Geneva Convention, is that demolishing homes as punishment is absolutely prohibited. It's not one of those issues where you have to balance two rights, or where there is, there are certain allowances in international law to do certain things. In the case of demolishing property without any kind of military necessity, this is an absolute prohibition. Now, I should also add, and B'Tselem is absolutely opposed to it. It's a barbaric practice. It's punishing literally in a very deliberate way, punishing the innocent, because, as I said earlier, people who were actually involved in these attacks could be tried and prosecuted for other offenses. So it's like a specific attempt to punish innocents. The Israeli government denies that this is punishment. They claim that this is about deterrence. I think these are semantics, because what you're doing is punishing. They claim, and they have done so successfully with the High Court. The High Court approves this policy and has approved it again and again. Sometimes the High Court will limit the scope of the demolition, but the High Court consistently approves Israel's practice of punitive demolition. And the Israeli authorities will claim that this will be a deterrent, deterrence against terrorism. The question is an open one. There's also in 2005, or 2004, a military committee that sat and looked into this issue, concluded that there was no clear evidence to demonstrate that it's an effective tool against terrorism, and there are also some convincing arguments to show that it's counterproductive because it enhances hatred and the desire for revenge, etc. And therefore they kind of recommended to stop. They didn't recommend to stop the practice, but the army then stopped the practice in 2005. But I should stress clearly that B'Tselem's position, and I think the clear position of international law, is that regardless of whether this is effective or not as a punishment, it is absolutely prohibited. It has the same status of torture in international law, which is absolutely prohibited regardless of the circumstances. So we are very clear when we talk about Israel's policy of demolishing homes as punishment. We are very clear that we are not interested in arguments about whether this is an effective tool for deterrence, because it's prohibited regardless. And even if it was effective, international law would reject this tool. So I'm posting now, again in the chat function for your kind of like post meeting reading, the background page from our website about punitive home demolitions. Really a shocking Israeli policy. Certainly it's a matter of policy. It's not about like decisions of any kind of individual soldier or officer. It's a matter of policy. It's approved by the highest political echelons. It's approved by the Israeli High Court. So it is given a seal of approval by Israel's highest legal authority, and it's absolutely unacceptable and must end. Now, this is not the only case of collective punishment that B'Tselem has documented throughout the West Bank. I think another really kind of prominent or common thing that would happen in the way that Israel treats Palestinians is basically kind of like punishing entire families or entire neighborhoods for the actions, or entire villages for the actions of individual Palestinians. I'm going to post now a report we did last year about the closure, the blocking off by the military of 5 West Bank villages as collective punishment. So you can kind of like read for yourself. And in 2020, this is, again, as I should also say, this is not some kind of unusual practice. This is a very routine method of oppression that Israel uses against Palestinian residents of the West Bank. Usually, over the last 20 years, Israel has either sealed off Palestinian villages with concrete blocks or has established these gates at the entrance of Palestinian villages. I assume most of you have visited the region clearly not during the last couple of years, but in the past, and have seen these things. But if you haven't, I think it's fair to imagine that the entrance or the exit from villages to main roads is often blocked by a gate. The gate can be open and then people can leave and come and go as they please, or the gate could be locked. And then the people are stuck in the village. They can't drive out. They could hike out, walk out, but not drive out. And the army has the keys. So very often the Israeli army, citing some sort of infraction like stone throwing or Molotov cocktail throwing by certain youth or men from the village, will punish the entire village by closing off the gate. So and this means not only the people who allegedly perpetrated these offenses, but every single person from the village who has any kind of need to drive out is affected. And this example that I added from January and February 2020 I think is a very good example of the routine blocking and harassment that people have to deal with. And it's, of course, I'm sure you can imagine, extremely disruptive to people's lives, and not only to people's daily lives, but also to the access to healthcare, to the access to work, education, and clearly, again, very, very clearly punishing an entire community for the actions, or the alleged actions, I should say, of individuals, instead of aiming to deal with the specific offense. So I think that's a very important example of what the Israeli army has been doing. Additionally, another, I think, important example of a restriction of movement is what we have seen since 2015 in the Hebron area. I'll post now the link to this story again, so you can see for yourself. You can read back and kind of try and assess for yourself, learn about this. And again, the army closed off the Tel Rumeida neighborhood in Hebron. As a result, this was part of the kind of like the escalation of 2015. The situation has not been remedied since then. So Tel Rumeida, there have been some easing of the restrictions, of the very massive restrictions on Tel Rumeida, the kind of like the most isolated Palestinian neighborhood in Hebron, but the restrictions have not been fully eased. So the residents of this neighborhood are having to deal with a total being shut down, facing massive movement restrictions as a result of the Israeli claims or as part of the Israeli policy to punish people for the actions of others. I think these are some good examples of these unacceptable restrictions that are applied to Palestinians. And certainly, if I want to link this issue back to the initial conversation or the initial discussion of apartheid, I think this is a very good example when you look at how the Israeli authorities punish Palestinians. Sometimes for their own actions, sometimes for the actions of others. It wouldn't occur to anyone, not that I'm advocating it, I should absolutely say that I'm not advocating it, but it would not occur to anyone to for the military to send the military to enter an Israeli settlement that is consistently attacking Palestinian villages in its vicinity. I'll give an example. For example, the Israeli settlement Yitzhar, no one would consider sending the military to just seal off the gate of that settlement and, as punishment for everyone, right? The authorities should locate the perpetrators of these offenses and bring them to justice. This is absolutely not happening. I should be clear about this, but this is, so none of this is happening. Additionally, I think no one considered for a second, and in fact, the Israeli High Court rejected this even as a possibility, the demolition of the homes of family members of Israeli settlers or Israeli Jewish supremacists who killed or injured Palestinians, who attacked Palestinians. So as I said, we're not advocating that. We absolutely are opposed to any form of collective punishment. But I think it's very clear that this is also a form of racial discrimination and a form of accepting that Israeli Jews and Palestinians are living under two completely separate regimes in which their rights are totally different. They are entitled to extreme, totally different protections under the law. The Palestinians in the West Bank live under Israeli military law, and Israeli settlers receive all of the benefits that being a citizen in a democracy will entail you, and certainly would not occur to any Israeli to go in and punish an Israeli settlement for its action. For example, if you look at Palestinian villages that participate in protests, there's a very common practice. There's and not just the Palestinian villages, it happens in East Jerusalem as well. Israel has a form of crowd control that is called the skunk. It's a very, very foul-smelling liquid that is sprayed from these very, large trucks, basically water cannon trucks. And very often you'll see Palestinian protesters, for example, recently in Sheikh Jarrah, sprayed with this terrible liquid. The entire streets, the entire neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah is constantly smelling of this because that's being used there so often. Inside Israel, it's absolutely, it's extremely rare for this to be used against Israelis and certainly against Jews. The one time where this was actually applied, a skunk was applied to Israeli Jews, was actually to an ultra-Orthodox protest. So that's also a group that is quite discriminated against on certain levels by the Israeli, or that is the subject of quite a lot of military, police violence within Israeli society. But when the water cannon was used against Israeli protesters, it did not involve the skunk, right? So I think it's many Palestinians view the spraying of the skunk, and I think quite rightly so, as a form of collective punishment of their entire community for example, the actions of some youth or children who throw stones. So maybe I should end this presentation on this note, and I'll try and go maybe through some of the questions. So bear with me a second because I have to actually read them. Or maybe Omar, yeah, exactly. If you maybe you'd like to help, that would.
So we have many questions, Sarit. The first question: does B'Tselem have a stand on a one-state or two-state solution?
Mm-hmm. So B'Tselem does not take a stand on the solution in any kind of solution to the conflict, one state, two states, etc. We think that human rights can be and should be guaranteed in any kind of future political solution, and therefore we do not take any stand on what should happen. The only benchmark, of course, is human rights, and the only demand we make is that the current reality, right, the current status quo cannot continue, but we don't take a position on how Israel and the Palestinians should resolve their differences. This is up to Israel and the Palestinians. However, we do say that Israel has the obligation to end the occupation regardless of any specific political diplomatic process, right? It's not, the occupation has to end right now, regardless of how eventually Israelis and Palestinians decide to reorganize their kind of like life together. We know we are about 13 million people now between the river and the sea, pretty much half and half Israelis and Palestinians. And certainly there needs to be justice and equality and rights for all. And it's up to everyone to decide on how that is done eventually.
Hello from Germany. Have the two papers on apartheid, B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch been discussed in the Knesset or in Israeli media?
So I'm pretty sure that the Human Rights Watch report was publicized, appeared in Israeli media. B'Tselem's report appeared I would not say extensively in Israeli media, but there was some coverage, and it was discussed in the Knesset, not in the plenum, but in a hearing organized by some opposition, well, not just opposition, but by some leftist members of Knesset, by Aida Tuma Suleiman from the Joint List and Mossi Raz from Meretz, the Meretz faction. And it was in a framework of a conference within the Knesset. Certainly, I don't think it'd become as a massive surprise that it caused quite a lot of backlash, drama, a lot of attacks against both B'Tselem and against these members of Knesset. But we are adamant we're not going to be silenced for continuing to describe how we see reality on the ground.
So, do you personally or as B'Tselem suffer for your work?
I mean, I think I should. It's a very big question. First of all, certainly B'Tselem has had to deal with attacks, both from the government, the previous one, we have a new coalition now, and that still remains to be seen how it exactly moves forward, because some aspects of, or some parts of the new coalition belong to the camp that is supportive of our work. Certainly during the last 10 years or even more, during the Netanyahu government's Israeli human rights groups, not just B'Tselem, I should say, we are part of a broad and very wonderful and amazing community of human rights organizations, have been under attack, right? We have had official incitement against us. We've had some administrative steps taken to try and harass us, not to the extent that our work is limited, but to the extent that adds that legislation has added some administrative kind of like demands to our work. It's additionally, kind of more work and also I think legislation that aims to portray us as these foreign, foreign elements, foreign agents. And all of this has been going on for many years. I think personally, I don't feel like I am threatened for my work. I feel, on the contrary, I feel like that I am a very privileged part of Israeli society. I'm an Israeli Jew. I enjoy both the rights that Israelis have in a democracy, but also all of the benefits that we Jewish citizens of Israel have. I should remind you that even though B'Tselem is an Israeli organization, we have many Palestinian staffers, both in our office and as our field researchers. Those Palestinian staffers are both West Bank residents or Israeli citizens, or in some cases residents, but they are subjected to far more intense pressures than I would be under any kind of circumstance. And I think for their impact on them could be merely because they are Palestinians. I mean, my Gazan colleagues had to deal with Israeli bombardments and the fear of these kinds of attacks during May, as one example, not because they are B'Tselem workers, but because they're Palestinians. But in some cases, my Palestinian colleagues are harassed because of their work. And I think the most prominent example of is my colleague Nasser Nawajar, who is our field researcher in the South Hebron Hills. And he's very often arrested and harassed and was even threatened by the security service for his work in documenting human rights violations. So I think it's important also to say that we still have a lot of freedom to express ourselves. I try to make my voice heard, even though we don't have a lot of, we certainly don't have an official status, but we don't have a lot of clout these days because Israeli society, we have to be fair and admit, has rejected primarily, or the majority of Israelis either have rejected our positions or don't really care, are not really interested in our perspective. But we are going to continue to try and make our voice heard with whatever tools we can.
Do you engage Israeli politicians?
So, I mean, it's a relatively new development because, as I said, for so many years, there's been a coalition that is not interested in any kind of contact with B'Tselem, views us as, either we are traitors or we're just kind of like delusional or certainly not interested in what we have to say. But now there is an Israeli coalition that involves one party called Meretz, which is a party that is interested in human rights and supports an end to the occupation. It is not, the portfolios that Meretz has in the current government are not really related to the occupation at all. So it's not actually impacting. The Israeli current coalition is a very strange kind of combination of different factions, right-wing, extreme right, and also left-wing and centrist. So it's not that we are getting a lot more access to a lot more majority politicians, but we do have some contact with coalition members. I don't think that's necessarily enabling us to make a massive change in the situation on the ground. And I also think it's very important to remember, and this I say very openly and blatantly whenever I'm discussing this situation, both inside Israel and abroad, to audiences abroad. I think there is currently no strong enough anti-occupation movement inside Israeli society that can somehow, pull ourselves up through our bootstraps, as it were, and end the occupation, right? Israelis are either not interested in changing this reality or actually supportive of the reality. This is by and large, and I should also be, this is not, I'm trying to be very concise. We need international engagement, we need the engagement, or we need action from the international community, and we need the support of international civil society, and we need international civil society to advocate with your own political leadership to make it clear that there needs to be this kind of international action. And this, as I said, we are attacked for this, for calling for international action, but I think it's absolutely not only our right as Israelis to demand that the international community intervene. This is not an internal Israeli matter, the occupation, but in fact, even beyond so, I think it's my obligation as an Israeli to call on the international community to take a stand.
We have another 30 questions, but we're not going to be able to answer them. Sorry.
But we're, please feel free
question.
to reach out to us and to look at our stuff, our website,
and hopefully we will invite you again without all of the difficulties. But there's a question that came up multiple times. How does your government or officials respond, Israeli officials, when you point out the variance between the deeds and the actions of the government and the Jewish moral principles?
Wow, that's a very weighty question. Look, I think I should say I'm not a religious person. I grew up in Israel, a Jew, which for me means a sense of moral duty and obligation, and especially considering the history both of my personal family suffering from racism, but also the Jewish people. But I don't think I have, a clear analysis of the entire, or a clear perspective, the entire picture. And I think it's very important to remember that Judaism as a moral kind of perspective that aims to correct society, to improve the world, to fix the world. Concept of tikkun olam, some of you might be familiar with it, is not how all Israelis and all Jews accept or define Judaism. In our society today, there are many different varying positions on what being Jewish means. Certainly, I think the jingoistic, racist, and Jewish supremacist perspective is either more prevalent or certainly as prevalent as the more universal, liberal, progressive perspective. And I think it would be wrong to try and describe things in a different way. If you look at consistently at public opinion surveys, asking Israeli Jews as to their positions, there is a kind of like quite a link between the degrees of religiosity and the degree of viewing, demand, or in some cases racism, and in other cases like demanding that the Jewish of Jewish supremacy. So like this notion that Israel is a Jewish democracy, I think, as B'Tselem described quite clearly, is not a realistic concept, right? But a lot of Israelis view the country as Jewish and view or think Jews should have preferential status. This is something I can't accept. I think this is clearly not a democracy, but it's a very common perspective, and it's shared by a lot of Israelis. And I think that, unfortunately, maybe is the perspective of most Israeli politicians, not all of them, but many of them. And another example, I think, of how it's very important for us as Israelis who do not share that perspective, right, who want to live in a democracy that offers equality, absolute equality to all of its citizens and all of people, not just, Israelis and Jews and Arabs, but also Palestinians living under our occupation currently, I think is something that also kind of like demonstrates the urgent need for international action, because this is, I think, not an acceptable future as part of or form from the perspective of the vast majority of people of conscience around the world and their governments.
One final question, and that's it. We're also skipping the action, Kumi action. So B'Tselem is very much against the occupation. What is the stand of B'Tselem on Palestinian refugees and the right of return?
So I should say that B'Tselem doesn't actually have a very clear stance on all of these issues. Similarly, I mean, like how on most of the final status issues, and we don't have a blueprint for how these issues should be resolved. Beyond to say, obviously, that there are clear human rights benchmarks. We've looked or we've done research on refugee issues, but primarily on the issues that are affecting refugees right now. The economic situation in refugee camps, Israeli incursions into refugee camps, etc., etc. And so kind of like focusing our research on the specific issues of the lives of Palestinian refugees, and only of Palestinian refugees in the West Bank, right? We do not have the capacity to do research on other areas in the Palestinian diaspora, but not on the general issue of the right of return.
But I mean, when it's just pushing forward more with this question, but with international law and within the basics of human rights, refugees have the right to go home. Why isn't Beit Salem stand clear?
Because we don't have it's clear that we do not take stands on many of the issues, and Beit Salem has chosen not to discuss this, and we don't have a position on the matter up until now. So I mean, I'm not able to say much more than what I said. The organization hasn't developed a specific human rights-based stance on this issue.
Many Palestinians feel not having also a stand is a position by itself.
Yeah, no, I accept that, and I know very well. And very often, this is a question that I think many Israelis are asked when they're in these kinds of conversations with Palestinian human rights groups and in these kinds of contexts. I don't have a lot. It's not that I can explain a lot more beyond the fact that the organization doesn't take a position on the right of return per se. But certainly takes a position on the situation of refugees currently in refugee camps and on different Israeli assaults, incursions, arrests, etc. So this is what I have to say.
And certainly not only takes a position, takes a very strong position. Beit Salem does amazing work, Palestine and Israel, and many people around the world, including myself, including Sabil, we appreciate your work. We use many of your resources. So thank you for the great work.
Thank you very much.
This session we will upload this session on YouTube, and we will send it and share it with many friends and with the rest of our community. So thank you, Sarit, and I hope to be able to meet you again.
Yeah, thank you everyone very much, and certainly looking forward to more and more engagement on your behalf with your own governments, with your own representatives. I think this is the key role of international civil society, and we're here to provide information and to have answer questions, etc. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and our apologies for everybody that we did not get reach your questions. So thank you all.
Yes, sorry.
And enjoy the rest of your day in a very and humid Tel Aviv.
Yes, absolutely. We'll try. Thank you very much, and goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye, everyone. Take care.